Welcome to Faith Wonders, where real stories of faith and miracles come alive from around the world.
The story of Ethan began long before the miracle. It began with tragedy, loss, and a quiet that seemed destined to last forever. Ethan was only 8 months old when the accident happened. His parents, Michael and Anna, had gone out for what should have been an ordinary evening drive. The roads of Michigan that night were slick with rain, reflecting the yellow glow of the street lamps. A sudden swerve, a screech of tires, and then the silence of finality. In a single moment, Ethan lost the two people who loved him most in the world. It was Clara, his grandmother, who received the devastating phone call. A widow herself, retired from her years of teaching at the local elementary school, Clara had thought her life was finally entering a season of rest. She spent her mornings tending the small rose garden behind her house, her afternoons knitting by the window, and her evenings with a book resting on her lap. She had learned to live with her solitude after losing her husband 5 years earlier. But fate, or perhaps providence, had other plans. Within hours of the accident, Ethan was placed in Clara's arms, a fragile infant with wide eyes that had already seen too much of the world's cruelty. As she rocked him in the quiet of her living room that night, Clara whispered a promise: "I will never let you feel alone." The months passed, and Clara poured her whole life into raising Ethan. She learned how to warm bottles again, how to change diapers, how to wake at 2 a.m. to the cries of a child. Her body ached with age, but her love overcame every limitation. Ethan became her reason to keep going. At first, he was like any other baby. Quiet, yes, but attentive. He had a way of staring at the light filtering through the curtains as if he were searching for something beyond the ordinary. Clara would sing to him softly, lullabies her daughter used to love, though she noticed Ethan never reacted much to the sound. By the time Ethan turned 2, the silence became impossible to ignore. Other toddlers babbled, tested words, called out for their mothers. Ethan remained wordless. His world was still, locked away behind a pair of deep brown eyes that seemed to understand more than he could ever express.
Doctors delivered the verdict Clara feared. Ethan had a profound case of autism. He might never speak, they said. He would need constant care, structure, therapy. Clara felt her chest tighten as the neurologist, Dr. Harris, explained the long road ahead. But when she looked down at Ethan, her grandson clutching a worn teddy bear in his tiny hands, she resolved in her heart, "I will walk this road with you, no matter how long it is." Life settled into a demanding routine. 3 times a week she drove Ethan to a speech therapist, twice a week to physical therapy. Once a month, they sat in the sterile waiting room of Dr. Harris's office, the air heavy with the antiseptic smell of alcohol wipes and the cries of restless children. Clara spent countless hours in those waiting rooms, her knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes never leaving her grandson. Despite the exhaustion, she never complained. She carried a quiet hope inside her, like a candle that refused to be extinguished. Maybe one day something will change. But for the moment, Ethan's world remained a life of silence. At home, his days were defined by rituals. He woke at 6:30 sharp, always sitting in the same chair for breakfast, sipping milk only from his blue cup. He played with the same 3 toys, a small red car he pushed across the floor in perfectly straight lines, a set of wooden blocks he arranged into rows rather than towers, and the teddy bear, soft, brown, and worn, that he hugged against his chest as if it were his anchor to the world. Any disruption of these rituals unsettled him deeply. If someone moved one of his blocks, he would push it back with force, sometimes knocking the whole row to the ground. Yet when the blocks were aligned just the way he wanted, a faint, fleeting smile would appear on his lips. That rare smile was like sunshine to Clara. She lived for those moments. She also noticed the things Ethan did not respond to. Music left him indifferent. Cartoons on television failed to capture his attention. Picture books filled with bright illustrations drew nothing more than a passing glance. And yet, there was one exception. Sundays. The first time Clara said, "Let's go to church," Ethan reacted in a way that startled her. Without a word, he walked straight to the front door, waiting patiently for her to fetch her purse and car keys. Inside the church, he did not fidget like other children. He did not cry or try to wander down the aisles. Instead, he walked with deliberate steps to the third pew on the right-hand side. There, he sat and fixed his gaze on the statue of the Virgin Mary near the altar. He would not move for the entire Mass. His lips would begin to tremble, forming shapes without sound. Clara thought at first he was just mimicking what he saw, but as the weeks turned into months, she noticed a pattern. Ethan only made those silent movements in two places: inside the church as he looked at the Virgin Mary, and at home, standing by his bedroom window before bedtime. Every night, the ritual was the same. He would stand by the glass, press his small hands together, and move his lips as though whispering to someone unseen. The night air drifted through the curtains, and the soft sound of crickets filled the silence. Then, after minutes of this wordless prayer, he would climb back into bed with calmness, pulling the blanket over himself as if he had completed something sacred. It was in these small, mysterious moments that Clara began to wonder, was Ethan truly silent, or was he speaking in ways no one else could hear? Her life had become a constant balance between exhaustion and faith. She had lost her daughter, her son-in-law, and the peaceful retirement she once imagined. But she had gained Ethan, and with him a sense of purpose she had never expected. Though he could not speak, though his silence often broke her heart, she loved him with a devotion fierce enough to carry them both. For Clara, the story of Ethan was already a story of love, sacrifice, and perseverance. She could not yet imagine that it would also become a story of miracle.
Clara often thought of life with Ethan as a carefully balanced scale. Every day she placed her energy, patience, and faith on one side, while on the other side rested Ethan's silence, his unpredictability, and his endless need for stability. Somehow, by grace or sheer will, the scales stayed even. The house had grown quiet since Ethan came into her care. Not the peaceful quiet Clara once cherished, but a silence heavy with meaning. Each day followed a rhythm dictated by Ethan's needs, a rhythm Clara came to respect as sacred. Mornings were the most predictable. Ethan would rise precisely at 6:30 a.m., padding down the hallway with his small, steady steps. He never missed the chair by the window at the kitchen table, the same chair every morning. Clara would pour his milk into the blue cup he demanded, and she never dared replace it with another. He ate his toast in small, deliberate bites, always crust first, never center. Any deviation risked tears, or worse, an anxious tantrum that left them both exhausted. Clara learned quickly that love in Ethan's world was expressed not through grand gestures, but through consistency. To love him was to honor his rituals, to see the patterns in his silence, and to never dismiss them as meaningless. After breakfast came his quiet play. The little red car made its straight journeys across the rug, back and forth, back and forth. The wooden blocks formed rows of perfect alignment, never towers. Clara sometimes longed to see him build a castle, to watch imagination spill from his hands. But for Ethan, order was his castle. His walls were not made of bricks, but of symmetry. It was during these quiet hours that Clara often prayed in her heart. As she sat in her worn armchair, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, she would watch him and whisper inwardly, "Lord, is this all there will ever be? Is this the whole story for my grandson?" Afternoons were reserved for therapy sessions. The drive to the clinic was always silent. Ethan stared out the window, his gaze fixed on the blur of trees and telephone poles. Clara sometimes tried to hum hymns as she drove, but Ethan never reacted. Once she reached over and touched his hand just to feel some connection. Ethan looked at her briefly, his eyes unreadable, before returning his gaze to the world outside. It was not rejection, Clara knew. It was simply his way of being. At the clinic, the therapists worked tirelessly. They coaxed him with flashcards, pictures of apples and cats, simple words like ball and cup. Sometimes Ethan responded by touching the correct image. Other times, he stared blankly, lost in his own realm. Clara watched every session from behind the one-way glass, her heart torn between hope and despair. She celebrated the smallest victories. The day Ethan nodded when asked if he wanted more juice. The day he clapped twice when prompted. Each step was monumental, even if the outside world would never notice. Evenings were calmer. Dinner was eaten quietly, Ethan with his blue cup once more, Clara with her soup. Afterward, he retreated to his room, where the ritual she had come to cherish most unfolded. The bedroom window became Ethan's altar. As each night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and fireflies began their gentle dance, Ethan would stand by the glass, his hands pressed together in prayer, his lips moving silently. Clara never interrupted, never tried to capture it with a camera. She only watched from the doorway, a witness to something she could not explain. At times, tears filled her eyes, not from sadness, but from the mysterious beauty of it. A boy who could not speak to the world seemed to be speaking to heaven itself.
One night, Clara finally whispered into the quiet, "Who are you talking to, my love?" Ethan did not turn. He did not answer. But his lips continued moving, soft and deliberate, as if he were speaking to someone who understood perfectly. Clara stepped closer, her old floorboards creaking beneath her feet. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder. Ethan startled, slightly, then looked up at her. His lips stopped, but his eyes, they were filled with a depth that caught her breath. For a fleeting second, she felt as though Ethan wanted to say something. But then, he lowered his gaze and climbed into bed, hugging his teddy bear. Clara kissed his forehead and whispered, "Good night, angel." The days rolled on, stitched together by these rituals. They were demanding, exhausting, but also strangely holy. Clara sometimes thought of herself as a guardian of silence, protecting Ethan's fragile world while waiting for something, anything to break through. But she also began to notice subtle changes. On Sundays at church, Ethan's silent prayers grew more intense. He no longer simply gazed at the Virgin Mary statue. He leaned forward, lips moving faster, his eyes shimmering with something beyond his years. Once, during the consecration, Clara swore she saw tears glisten on his cheeks. She wondered if anyone else noticed, but to the rest of the congregation, Ethan was just a quiet child. Only Clara seemed to recognize the mystery unfolding before her. At home, his nightly prayers lengthened. Sometimes he stayed at the window for nearly a half hour. Once, Clara thought she heard the faintest sound escape his lips. A breath, a murmur, something almost like a word.
She froze in the hallway, afraid that moving might shatter the fragile moment. But the sound faded, leaving only silence. These glimpses filled Clara with hope and longing. She prayed harder than ever, begging God to reveal what was happening in Ethan's world. If there is a voice inside him, let it come out. Let him speak, if only one word. Her prayers, like Ethan's, rose into the quiet night. Neither of them knew it yet, but the silence that defined their lives was preparing to break. The rituals that shaped their world, the car, the blocks, the window prayers, were not just habits. They were the threads of a tapestry being woven by unseen hands. And soon, that tapestry would reveal a miracle. The window and the church, two places that had become sacred ground in Ethan's young life. One was the quiet square of glass overlooking the night sky, where whispers rose like incense. The other was the humble parish where light poured through stained glass and faith gathered in hushed devotion. Between the two, Clara began to see a mysterious thread tying her grandson to something beyond this world. Every night, the ritual at the window continued. Ethan would stand, small and fragile against the vastness of the dark sky. His breath fogged the glass, his lips moved silently, and his little hands folded together with a solemnity far older than his 5 years. Clara often watched from the doorway, her heart stirring with questions. There was no doubt anymore. This was not random motion, not meaningless mimicry. Ethan's lips moved with cadence, with rhythm. He paused, as though listening. He resumed, as though answering. Sometimes his face softened in a smile. Other times his brow furrowed in concentration. It was a dialogue, though Clara could only hear half of it. One evening, unable to restrain her curiosity, Clara whispered again, "Ethan, are you speaking to someone?" To her astonishment, Ethan turned, meeting her eyes directly. It was rare for him to hold eye contact for more than a second, but this time his gaze lingered. Slowly he nodded. Clara's breath caught. "Who, my love?" Ethan raised a small hand and pointed upward toward the sky. Then he placed the same hand over his chest. It was all he offered, but for Clara it was enough to ignite wonder. Was he speaking to God, to his parents, to some heavenly figure only he could see? She wanted to press further, but something stopped her. She sensed this moment was not hers to intrude upon. So she only whispered back, "That's beautiful, Ethan," and kissed the top of his head before letting him continue. Days later, Ethan's teacher, Mrs. Johnson, approached Clara after class. "There's something unusual about your grandson," she said gently, her voice filled with both concern and admiration. "During art time, he drew something remarkable." She showed Clara the paper. On it was a crude but recognizable figure of a woman, a long robe, a veil over her head. The lines were shaky but deliberate. Clara's heart raced. "Do you know who this is, Ethan?" she asked when they were home. Ethan touched the drawing, then pointed to the small statue of the Virgin Mary sitting on Clara's mantel. Clara sat down heavily, clutching the drawing. The Virgin Mary? She had never explicitly taught him to draw her. He had never spoken a word, never even shown interest in images. Yet here she was, appearing on his paper as if she had been imprinted on his soul. Sundays, too, carried their own mystery. The church was a simple building, with white walls and wooden pews polished by years of use. Families filled its aisles, voices rising in hymns that echoed against the ceiling. From the very beginning, Ethan had shown a strange attraction to the church. Clara would lead him inside, expecting him to fidget, as children often did, But no, Ethan always went straight to the third pew on the right, sat down, and fixed his gaze at the statue of Mary near the altar. Week after week, it was the same. Ethan's lips moved almost the entire Mass, his little shoulders straight, his eyes intent. While other children squirmed or whispered, Ethan was motionless, lost in his silent exchange with the figure of Mary. At first, Clara assumed it was imitation, but the longer she observed, the clearer it became. This was not simple mimicry. Ethan was engaged in something purposeful. His lips did not move aimlessly. They moved with pauses, with expressions, as though he were responding to an unseen voice. Clara sometimes leaned closer during Mass, trying to catch a sound. But Ethan remained silent, the words locked between his heart and whoever he was addressing. One Sunday, after Mass, Clara asked Father Michael about it. "Father," she began hesitantly, Do you think my grandson could be communicating with Mary, with heaven?" The priest smiled kindly, laying a hand on her shoulder. "Faith teaches us that children often see and understand more than we adults do. Don't dismiss it too quickly, Clara. Perhaps the Virgin has chosen to be near him." Clara carried those words home like a secret treasure. Over time, the connection between the window and the church became undeniable. Ethan would pray at night, and then on Sunday he would repeat the same lip movements in front of the statue of Mary. The rhythm matched, the expressions matched. Clara began to suspect that what Ethan whispered at the window, he continued in the church, and what he began in the church, he carried back home to the window. It was as though the two spaces formed a sacred circle, and within it, Ethan walked with the unseen. One night, Clara approached him again. "Ethan, what does she say to you?" Ethan looked up from the window, his eyes wide and calm. For a moment, Clara thought he might actually answer. His lips parted, a faint breath escaping. But no word came. Instead, he simply smiled, one of those rare, delicate smiles that always lit up Clara's heart, and returned to his prayer. Clara pressed her hand against her chest, overwhelmed. She did not understand the mystery, but she knew one thing for certain. Her grandson was not alone in his silence. As the weeks passed, subtle signs continued to appear. Ethan seemed calmer after his window prayers. He responded better to gestures and instructions. His therapists noticed increased focus. His teacher reported that he was more present during class. And always, at the center of it all, was Mary, her image in the church, her unseen presence at the window, the figure on his drawing. Clara's faith deepened. She found herself praying alongside Ethan more fervently. At night, after tucking him into bed, she would linger by her own window, whispering, "Bless him, Mother. Speak to him if you must, but please let me hear him one day too." The silence in their home no longer felt empty. It felt charged, alive, as though waiting for something. Neither Clara nor Ethan could know it yet, but the window and the church were not just settings in their daily life. They were sanctuaries preparing to host a miracle that would change everything.
Warm, heartfelt, reverent voice, like a friend sharing a sacred story naturally. Change often begins quietly, like a seed pushing through soil before anyone notices. For Clara, it was the smallest details that first caught her attention. Subtle shifts in Ethan's behavior, fragile signs that something within him was awakening. It started on a rainy Tuesday morning. Clara was in the kitchen, pouring oatmeal into bowls, when she heard the faint rustle of fabric from Ethan's room. Normally, she had to dress him, guiding each small arm into a sleeve, each leg into a pant leg. But that morning, when she entered his room, she froze. Ethan stood there, pajamas discarded neatly on the bed. He had pulled on his shirt, backwards, yes, but on by himself. His pants were half-zipped, his socks mismatched, but he had tried. Clara pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "You did this?" she whispered. Ethan looked up at her, his expression calm, almost proud. Then he simply nodded once. For the rest of the day, Clara felt as if she were walking in a dream. It was such a simple act, yet monumental. For years, Ethan had resisted independence, retreating into routine and stillness. Now, without prompting, he had taken a step forward. Other signs followed. At school, Mrs. Johnson reported that Ethan began holding crayons with more intent. Instead of scribbling, he drew shapes, circles, crosses, sometimes little rays of light bursting outward. "It's as though he's trying to tell us something," the teacher said softly. During therapy sessions, his occupational therapist noted increased focus. He stacked blocks not randomly, but in patterns. 3 on one side, 2 on the other, balanced like miniature altars. His hands, once restless, now moved with deliberate care. Clara also noticed his growing attentiveness to sound. Once, when the church bells rang at noon, Ethan paused mid-step, tilted his head and smiled. He had heard them before, but now it seemed as if he was listening. Then came the most astonishing moment of all. One afternoon, Clara sat at the window with him, watching as his lips moved in silent rhythm. Suddenly, he stopped, turned to her, and placed a hand gently on her cheek. His touch was tender, deliberate. He held her gaze, his eyes clearer than ever before. Though he did not speak, the gesture carried a weight Clara could not describe. It was as though he were saying, "You are part of this too." Tears blurred her vision. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered, holding his small hand against her face. "Thank you." From then on, Clara noticed herself changing as well. She found patience where before there was only exhaustion. Hope bloomed where despair had lived. She began to expect miracles, not in grand flashes, but in tiny increments of progress, each one a thread of grace. Father Michael, too, began to observe Ethan more closely during Sunday Mass. One day, after service, he approached Clara. "Did you see him today? He raised his hand during the prayer of intercession. Not randomly. He lifted it right when the congregation said, 'Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us.'" Clara's heart swelled. She had seen it too. Ethan's gestures were no longer isolated movements. They carried intention, almost reverence. Yet with each sign of growth, Clara's longing deepened. "When will he speak?" she prayed nightly. "When will I hear his voice?" She reminded herself not to rush God, but her yearning was fierce. To hear her grandson call her name even once, that would be her miracle. Still, she cherished each moment, each small transformation. For the first time in years, life felt like it was moving forward. The silence in their home no longer weighed like a burden. It shimmered with possibility. And though she did not know it, these quiet signs were not just progress. They were the dawn before the miracle. The morning began like no other. Quiet, golden, and charged with a strange anticipation.
Clara awoke before dawn, as she often did, but this time she sensed something stirring in the air. The world outside was hushed. Even the birds had not yet begun their song. When she stepped into Ethan's room, she stopped in her tracks. Ethan was already awake. Not only awake, but dressed. His shirt was buttoned, his pants neatly in place, socks matched perfectly, better than she herself could have done. Her hair, usually tousled, had been smoothed with water, as if he had prepared himself for something important. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked at her and smiled, small and serene. Then, without words, he reached for his shoes, slid them on, and stood ready. Clara's heart pounded. It was Sunday, yes, but Ethan had never shown this kind of initiative before. He usually resisted the early routine, reluctant to dress, dragging his feet to church. Today he was not only ready, but waiting. By the time they stepped outside, dawn was breaking. The sky glowed pale pink and lavender, the air crisp with the scent of dew. Ethan walked slightly ahead of Clara, his steps light, purposeful, as though he knew exactly where he was going. At the church, they arrived earlier than usual. Only a handful of parishioners were there, kneeling in prayer. Candles flickered gently near the altar, their flames casting soft halos against the walls. The air was filled with the faint aroma of incense, still lingering from the early morning rosary. Ethan did not hesitate. He moved down the aisle with quiet determination, stopping at the third pew on the right, his usual spot. But instead of sitting, he knelt immediately, folding his hands together, his eyes fixed on the statue of Mary, bathed in the first rays of sunlight streaming through the stained glass window. Clara slid into the pew beside him, her heart racing. Something about this morning felt different. The church was unusually silent, as though it too were holding its breath. For several minutes, Ethan remained still, lips moving in that familiar rhythm. But now there was something more, a sense of intensity, of urgency, as though he were not merely praying, but conversing deeply. Clara closed her eyes and prayed with him. Mother Mary, whatever is happening here, guide him, guide us. When she opened her eyes, she noticed Father Michael entering quietly through the side door. He paused, observing Ethan with quiet wonder, then gave Clara a nod of acknowledgement, as if to say, "I see it too." The pews gradually filled as more parishioners arrived. Yet even as the whispers of greetings and shuffling of feet filled the space, Ethan remained absorbed, untouched by the noise around him. His entire being seemed tuned to something beyond the ordinary. Then something happened that nearly broke Clara's composure. Ethan lifted his hands, palms upward, as if receiving something unseen. His face tilted toward the statue, radiant with a light Clara had never seen before. His lips moved more clearly now, his chest rising with each silent phrase. Clara pressed her hands together, tears spilling freely. The atmosphere was thick with reverence, almost electric. Even those who did not understand what they were witnessing seemed drawn into the hush, their eyes turning toward the small boy at the front. Time stretched. Clara could no longer tell if minutes or hours were passing. All she knew was that Ethan was on the brink of something. She could feel it in her bones, in the very air she breathed. And then,
Just before Mass was about to begin, Ethan turned to Clara. His eyes glistened, his lips parted, and for a moment Clara thought she heard the faintest sound. But the word did not come, not yet. Instead, he reached for her hand, holding it firmly as though preparing her for what was about to unfold. Clara squeezed back, whispering through her tears, "I'm ready, Ethan. Whatever it is, I'm ready." The candles flickered, the bells rang, and the church seemed to draw in a single collective breath. The miracle was not yet spoken, but it was near, very near.
The church bells rang out at 9 o'clock sharp, their deep tones reverberating through the rafters. The congregation had gathered, filling the pews with quiet anticipation. Yet an unusual hush lingered over the sanctuary, as if every soul present sensed something extraordinary was about to occur. Ethan remained in the third pew, hands folded, eyes locked on the statue of the Virgin Mary. Clara sat beside him, her pulse quickening with every second. She felt as though the air itself carried weight, pressing upon her chest and urging her to stay still, to watch. Father Michael began the homily, his voice gentle yet steady. "Faith," he said, "is not only what we proclaim with our lips, but also what we live in silence." His words seemed almost prophetic, as though unknowingly preparing the congregation for what to unfold. At precisely 9:43, Ethan stirred. Clara glanced at him quickly, her breath catching. He rose slowly from his seat, movements deliberate, almost solemn. Every eye in the church turned toward the small boy who had never spoken a single word in his 5 years of life. Whispers spread across the pews, but they were soon silenced as Ethan stepped into the center aisle. His shoes echoed softly on the stone floor, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. He walked with a confidence and composure far beyond his years. Reaching the front of the church, Ethan stopped before the statue of the Virgin Mary. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, casting hues of gold and blue upon the figure, as if heaven itself had chosen to spotlight this very moment. Then it happened. Ethan lifted his gaze and parted his lips. From his mouth came a single word, clear and unwavering: "Mary." The sound echoed in the sanctuary like a bell rung from the depths of innocence. Gasps erupted across the congregation. Clara clutched her chest, tears streaming freely down her face. But Ethan was not finished. His voice grew stronger, steadier, as though guided by a presence beyond himself. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." Line by line, he recited the prayer with flawless precision, his tone pure, unbroken, filled with reverence. Every syllable rang through the church, silencing the world beyond its walls. No one breathed, no one moved. The only sound was Ethan's voice rising like a hymn, as if heaven itself had opened to let it pass through. By the time he whispered the final words, "Pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death, Amen," the church was awash in tears. Some parishioners fell to their knees. Others pressed their hands over their mouths in awe. Ethan stood still for a moment, lips moving silently as though still conversing with the unseen lady. Then he turned, walked back down the aisle, and sat beside Clara. She embraced him tightly, whispering through sobs, "Oh, Ethan, my sweet boy." To her astonishment, Ethan turned his head, met her gaze, and spoke again, haltingly, but unmistakably. "Grandma, the beautiful lady, said I can speak now." Clara's tears fell harder. "The lady? Who, Ethan?" He raised his small hand, pointing directly at the statue of Mary. His voice was filled with a serenity far too profound for his age. "She talks to me here, and at the window. She taught me the prayer. She said, I am never alone."
At that, Father Michael stepped forward, his own eyes glistening. Kneeling down before Ethan, he asked softly, "What else does she tell you, child?" Ethan's expression did not falter. He placed his hand over his heart. "She teaches me about God. She says, I belong to Him." A collective shudder passed through the church. In that moment, there was no doubt left. What they had witnessed was not simply a child's first words. It was a miracle, a divine gift bestowed upon an innocent soul. Clara held Ethan close, her heart overflowing with gratitude. For years, she had prayed for this day, never knowing if it would come. Now, surrounded by 200 witnesses, she knew heaven had answered. The congregation broke into prayer, voices trembling but unified. "Hail Mary, full of grace," they echoed, this time led not by priest or choir, but by the miraculous voice of a child. And as the prayer swelled within those sacred walls, Clara felt a peace she had never known. Ethan had been silent for 5 years, but now, through the intercession of the Virgin Mary, the world could finally hear him. From that day on, Ethan's voice grew stronger, his words more confident. His speech came slowly, yes, but each word was a treasure, each sentence a testimony. Yet no matter how much progress he made, he never forgot the lady who had given him back his voice. Every Sunday, in that very pew, Ethan continued to gaze at the Virgin Mary with childlike devotion, and Clara, sitting beside him, never ceased to marvel at the miracle she had been chosen to witness, the day heaven opened and a boy's silence was broken forever.